And before we get going, here's a word about our sponsors. SDHQ Motorsports is a powerhouse 30,000 square foot facility with 45 family members reporting for duty. This single owner, single location business is based out of Gilbert, Arizona. It can handle anything from a hot rod, daily driver, pre-runner, race vehicle, half-track or Kugelwagen, or just about any other project you need help with. Their skilled staff with hundreds of years of combined experience eats, sleeps, and breathes performance. So go check them out at sdhqmotorsports.com or check them out on Insta at sdhqmotorsports. The We Happy Few 506 podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Gettysburg Museum of History, home of the Major Dick Winters collection and the largest assortment of authentic Band of Brothers artifacts in the world. Visit the free museum at 219 Baltimore Street in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, or at www.gettysburgmuseumofhistory.com, and on the YouTube channel, The History Underground, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Well, hello, and welcome along to another We Happy Few 506 podcast, The Nearly Men, or Nearly Man, as it should be, as it's just me. I think Doug's on a motorbike pinion with Alex Sabger at the moment, somewhere on the Nürburgring or something. So he may come, he may not. But in the meantime, I do have a very cool guest. Welcome to the podcast, Tony Rushmer. How are you doing, Tony?
Good form. Thanks so much for having me, Matt. Really looking forward to catching up and shooting the breeze. As I said, I just warmed up with Bobby Schofield, so can't promise to be as entertaining and insightful as Bobby, Dave Kershaw, as he was in Rogue Heroes. But yeah, really looking forward to catching up.
Well, Bobby is a character and law in and of himself, so just be yourself, and at least I'll probably understand you, which is better. I won't need to subtitle this podcast. Bobby, I know if you're listening, I love you. So we'll crack on in several different directions. Basically, we want to talk about your book. We want to talk about Reg Seekings and stuff like that. But if you don't mind, because I did a little bit of research on you, and your book, Duty Before Glory, which is Reg's story, which is great, and we'll deep dive into that. But it's not a natural fit to what you've done beforehand, is it? What's your background, as much as you want to tell us, leading up to this, and then what got you involved in writing a book about such a quintessential World War II hero such as Reg?
Yeah, good questions. Lots to unravel there.
Yeah.
You're right. I'm a sports journalist, have been, still am, still turn up in football grounds and sit in press boxes and tap out 500 words on the whistle, that kind of thing. That's what I've done over, maybe 30 years, covering horse racing, football, golf, and, loved it, still love it. But I suppose during lockdown, there wasn't much football to get too excited about. And was sat there trying, like we all were doing, entertain oneself, channel hopping away, and just landed on McIntyre's documentary about the wartime SAS, which I knew nothing about. It was a new subject area. There was kind of tales of daring do and gallantry, and as there were precious little tales of daring do and gallantry in the sporting world at that time, I was kind of locked in. And there was an accent of a man on there because there was some archive interview footage that they were relying on to help weave the story. And it was a lot of the SAS originals who were interviewed in the 1980s. And the guy that sort of gripped me most was Reg Seekings. And I didn't know where he hailed from, who he was, anything about him. Googled him and found out that he came from a mile away or mile and a half away from the sofa I was sat on. I just couldn't believe it. There I was, sort of bored, looking for something of interest, and found out that, Wartime Hero was from literally two drivers and a pitching wedge down the road. It was Reg, and I knew I needed to know more.
Where is that exactly?
So Reg hails from just outside Ely in the Cambridgeshire Fens. Yes. I was sat in the Cambridgeshire Fens in Ely on that fateful evening when I first came across the wartime S in earnest. And Reg's home, he lived and worked before the war as a farm labourer, farm worker, as his father was, as his brother was, on the fields, as most of the young men in this neck of the woods, were involved in. But before the war, it was kind of, it still is. There's lots of agriculture in this part of the world, and Reg grew up following the family footsteps. But he always wanted more. At the same time, he was a developing his boxing prowess, and that was kind of where he was viewing an escape route from life on the fields.
Right. And because I guess, not jumping too far ahead with Reg's story, but do you suppose that's what hardened him up? But I mean, there's a lot more to it, isn't it? Like, you can't just be a farm labourer and then join the SAS. What did you find out from his childhood when you were piecing together his story that you thought that gave him the nuts and bolts to be in the SAS? Because I can't give too much away, but I have relatives in the SAS, or had. He's actually passed away now, and they're quite unlikely characters. Like, I met some serving SAS guys when I was with my uncle. Wasn't a real uncle, we called him uncle. And there's a lot that goes into, like, psychologically, there's a lot that goes into someone being able to be in that sort of situation and be so cool.
So let me tell you about Reg's background. His dad was a professional soldier in the Bedfordshire Regiment. So his father fought in the Great War, sustained a very serious shrapnel injury at the Third Battle of Ypres, and returned from the war with a hole in his back. You could put your fist in the hole in his back by all accounts. He was serious. He lay alone in no man's land for 3 days, and he was a quiet man, and he always instilled in his sons, you must do your duty. It was a really, he was not in, he wasn't by any means gregarious. He wasn't boisterous, but that was something. He said, whatever happens in life, you do your duty. And that was the words that he sent them off to war with, which we'll come to. But his mother was a very different sort of person. She was outgoing and she was fiery. So there was a story going around that the family Ludo board ended up in the fire at Christmas when she started getting beat. So, there was a sort of must win at all costs. So you can see how he was shaped, as you alluded to, by the land, in this neck of the woods, and also by both of his parents. So there was strong influences coming from both sides, mum and dad, and also this environment.
And also, and this, I often talk about this with the guys that we played in Band of Brothers, and they came from all walks of life, but a lot from that sort of that Depression generation, guys off of farms, guys that hadn't left the town. Do you know what I mean? Guys that hadn't, that were looking for adventure. If you're a farm labourer in Ely at that time and the war doesn't break out, chances are that's where you're spending most of your life until your back goes out, and then do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
About 42 because you've worked yourself into a state of incapability, and so this opportunity comes along, and it's like, right, I'm going to go on an adventure here, and I'm going to throw myself into it. Did he sign up straight away?
So how it so just before we got to the point where he was in the Cambridgeshire Regiment, he, as you said, he didn't want to spend his life on the fields. He was much more ambitious than that. He was much more. He needed to be someone. He was much more driven, and so he had started to box to quite a high level, to the point that, ironically, there is newspaper reports that I landed on that he was fighting in Wisbech, which is also in the Cambridgeshire Fens, and his opponent was a man who was a police officer in the Cambridgeshire Constabulary, whose name was Pat Riley. They fought in the ring twice, and then they both went off to war. And the next time they saw one another was at Cabrit, where the SAS originals gathered in late August, early September 1941, and it was a case of, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? They had seen each other boxing in the ring in Cambridgeshire a couple of times, and they rocked up to be part of David Sterling's sort of freshly minted unit. So he wanted to box because he saw that as a way out of the of farming. He wanted to make potentially his living and enough money potentially to acquire a small holding, because obviously he was at the behest of a farmer that he worked for, and he saw himself as, he was more ambitious than that. He just didn't want to do that job that you alluded to. So he joined, the Cambridgeshire Regiment, became a divisional boxing champion in the east of England. Obviously, war broke out as a young territorial. He went up to North Norfolk, early part of the war, and then into the Commandos the following year, which is how he found himself in North Africa as part of a formation called Lay Force. That disbanded in the summer of 1941, and one of the officers, the young officers that was in Lay Force, was Scotsman David Stirling, and he sort of pitched his blue skies vision for a different type of warfare in a meeting at Geneva Depot near Suez, and Reg was in.
But he was. Where did he do his commando training? Was it up in Scotland?
Yeah, he started with 7 Commando, and there's a bit of a story that gives you an idea as to the sort of fella he was. When he was with the Cambridgeshire Regiment in North Norfolk, it just wasn't enough for him, and as soon as there was a chance to volunteer for special duties, he was looking to get out and beyond, because he wanted to be, in his work, he wanted to be a parachutist. That was what excited him. Right. And there was one instance where returns hadn't been given by his company for in response to volunteering for a special service duties. He was informed about this, and he was acting company runner at the time, and he snuck into the company office, found out that the list hadn't been completed. Never mind was his name on it, despite volunteering. So he wrote down his own name and returned it into the hands of the adjutant and said, yeah, I'm volunteered. And he found himself off to 7 Commando, who at that point were starting up in the summer of 1940 in Felixstowe in Suffolk. And from there, as you said, it was on to west coast of Scotland, Isle of Arran, and they left end of January 1941 to head to North Africa as part of, I think it was 7 Commando, 8 Commando, and 11 Commando, known as Lay Force under Colonel Bob Laycock. And off they went to North Africa, where obviously Rommel had started to get things going, the Axis favour in the early part of that year. So that was his year or so in the Commandos and his training.
And what were they assigned to do in North Africa, 7 Commando? And where did Reg see action?
Yeah, I mean, he was only involved in a really, really unsatisfying action as far as he was concerned. It was his only operation for 7 Commando. There was a town called Bardia on the North African coast, and he barely saw the enemy in that amphibious infiltration. And unfortunately, he came back with an infected leg. That meant that he was hospitalised when his brother, who was also in 7 Commando, and their big pal, Eric Musk, who's from the next door large conurbate, a place called Soham, which is just up the road from Ely, Bob Seekings and Eric Musk went off to Crete to take part in the fighting withdrawal, and Reg got left behind, which he was absolutely just fuming, frustrated, disappointed, anxious, because he knew what was coming. The word coming back from Crete wasn't good.
I'm going to say, any good as me.
It was a difficult start to his war, a seriously difficult start to his war. And, by the summer of 1941, he was, by the way, Bob escaped on a landing craft. Once it became clear that he wasn't part of the official evacuation from Crete, and he and a party spent 10 days at sea before drifting back behind home lines in Egypt. It was incredibly difficult 10 days at sea where there was no food. There was all sorts of deprivations, but they got back, and Reg was just relieved beyond relief to see his brother and pal, because the worst thought was this was his younger brother, and he just couldn't countenance the thought of going back home and telling his mum and dad that we don't know what's happened to Bob, but I'm back home. He just couldn't have it. It was really eating him up. So it was massive relief to see his bro and pal. And it was shortly after that word reached him about this new unit that a young Scots officer from 8 Commando was setting up. Of course, it was L Detachment of the Special Air Service.
And so How did he volunteer for that? How did a person volunteer for that back in the day? Did you just rock up to David Sterling's tent and say, I'm in? Or was there a vetting process?
I think Sterling at that time was going, it was giving his elevator pitch to likely lads. And obviously, Lay Force was in the throes of being disbanded. These were elite troops that had special level of training and were kind of designed for the sort of operations that he had in mind, which was small scale infiltration behind enemy lines, deep behind enemy lines. And so they were the right type of caliber of men. So he gave a presentation at a Geneva depot, which was a huge, great holding depot, massive depot near Suez. And when Reg went in, saw what David Sterling was all about. He was impressed. Sterling came in quiet, dynamic, purposeful, explained that this wasn't going to be a conventional type of warfare. He was seeing it very differently. Reg's interest was piqued. He had a short individual interview where he told David Sterling that he was a boxing champion before the war, a divisional boxing champion, and also that he longed to be a parachutist. As I say, he'd volunteered for these sort of duties earlier in the war and had been rejected initially because he was told he was too big to be a parachutist. But here was this opportunity. He wasn't going to miss it. And so at the end of, Sterling was clearly impressed, said, "You're in." And along with 60 other ranks and 6 officers, he was part of L Detachment, the first men of the SAS, which, I find was quite incredible. And I think of he was there right from day one and went all the way through the war with the SAS. He didn't miss a beat for the next, as I say, 4 years almost.
Yeah, that is absolutely incredible. I guess we should talk a bit about their training, their unique training. Correct me if I'm wrong. Was it Jock Lewis that trained them?
He was. So there are three really real linchpin members of the early SAS. David Sterling, who politiqued to ensure that L Detachment was established as a small unit with small overheads. They were given the green light for this unconventional, different type of warfare. His trainer, for want of a better phrase, was the genius that was Jock Lewis, who, along with, just incredible, just visionary ways of doing things. Reg had huge respect for him because the man himself commanded that. He had a huge presence. He would do everything that he asked the men to do when it came to all these marches and water discipline. So you couldn't slug on your bottle of water. Yeah. He did everything that those guys did.
Yeah, but he was allowed. Sorry, I was just saying that. He was an incredible guy. Was he Australian? I think he might have been. Was that right?
I think he'd had heritage in Australia, right. And also he was Oxford University, where he was kind of like a rowing blue. So I think he belonged to an elite social strata. He had ideas. You'll know as much about Jock Lewis as I do, by the sounds of it. Suffice to say, his training methods were off the charts genius. At the same time, by the way, he was inventing an incendiary explosive, the Lewis bomb, that these guys would use and attach to the planes, and they were their target on the airfields of North Africa. When he wasn't training these guys through the night or teaching them X, Y, and Z, he was out there just inventing this bomb that was this incendiary explosive that was going to do all the damage. He was just a different level of brain, and Sterling relied on him and his training expertise and high standards to set the levels, set the benchmarks for what was actually required for these operations. And then the third one, before we get any further, which we will speak about, was Paddy Mayne, of course, who'd come from 11 Commando, where he'd built up a reputation as outstanding soldier, warrior. That reputation would only grow in his years during his time with the SAS. So they were the 3 key linchpin figures in the early months of the SAS and beyond.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to point out as well that Jock Lewis was also bonkers good looking as well, as I remember.
He was handsome, yeah. I mean, some guys have all the luck, don't they, Matt?
They really do, yeah. I think, a weapons grade womanizer as well. So, like, he basically ticked all the boxes for, like, boys' own hero for everybody. And maybe we should we get into David Sterling as well? I mean, when we go to Normandy, and we go see Paul Woodidge and stuff like that, and we do tours and stuff like that, what he likes to do is he likes to debunk Band of Brothers stuff, and he always like weirdly apologizes to me. I was like, I didn't write it, I was just in it. Maybe like from what we've seen from the show SAS Rogue Heroes and stuff, what was David Sterling really like? Because I mean, the characterizations are what they are in the show, and they're fun and everything. And Paddy Mayne was actually 6'4" and played lock for the British and Irish Lions against South Africa, and Chuck Lewis was this incredibly beautiful looking man. And what was David Sterling like? Because he was basically a politician, really. You mentioned it before, politicking. He was just brilliant at putting people together and getting what he wanted.
I think I don't know if you've spoken to the SAS expert author Gavin Mortimer, who is he's written a book about he's written several books, many books on the SAS, and he introduces Bill Sterling, who was David Sterling's brother, and there was also another Sterling in Cairo, and they were incredibly intelligent, well-connected people. And I think, without wishing to conjecture too much, my own view is Sterling had the ear of high command at Middle East headquarters, which meant that he could espouse his ideas and his vision. It might not be all his own vision; it might be those of his brothers as well. But I think that having spoken to Mike Sadler, who was one of the known as an honorary original. Mike was initially with the Long Range Desert Group and actually took Reg and Paddy Mayne as part of a 6-man patrol into Tamet for the first successful operation in December 1941. Mike had, gave me the idea that David was very busy away at times, politicking is the word, leveraging the development of this newly formed unit. And I think without that input, the SAS may never have had the momentum to get off the ground. So I think he plays a very, very important role, but obviously was reliant on, I think, his brother Bill Sterling for a lot of the ideas. Again, Gavin is the expert, but I just think that we mustn't underestimate just how important he was in driving forward these ideas and just making sure things happened. You know how you sometimes need someone to really drive something to get it done. Well, I think that from having spoken to Mike, he was that person. Reg, I think, in one of because I, as part of my research, I listened to 17 audio reels that Reg recorded in the 80s and read series of notebooks that he wrote after the war, in the decade after the war. And there's no doubt that he held Sterling in the highest esteem and was fully aware of just everything David Sterling did to build the brand in the early weeks, months, and get the whole thing going. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's sort of exactly how I envisaged him to be as well. And it is right. That's exactly who you need. You can't have too many all-action Paddy Mayne types, otherwise nothing's going to get off the ground. You're just going to end up fighting and all sorts of stuff. You need a politician, you need a bureaucrat, and you need someone who has people's ear to get you the equipment you need, the manpower you need, and to get it done and get it written off.
All of that, and he had the drive, the dynamism to move things forward. And he wasn't taking no for an answer, and I think that's really important. I think that the whole thing would never have had the momentum had he not sort of just come in with that vision for driving it on. And I admire him greatly for what he established.
Was Mike Sadler the fellow that could read the stars like a map by just looking? Unbelievable.
Mike was just one of the best. I mean, this book has, as you said at the beginning, I came from a very different background. So the book has opened up lots of interesting contacts and allowed me to meet lots of people from interesting walks of life and ex-SAS soldiers, lots of special forces soldiers. But the one that's been the greatest privilege for me to speak with and get to know was Mike Sadler. Now, Mike, the last couple of years of his life was spent in a residential home in Cambridgeshire, so not far from me, and really very grateful. Had the opportunity to see him a lot over that 2-year period, and what an extraordinary man, as you say. Astral navigation, looking up at the stars. I don't know how you do it. How do you do it? I mean, I did try and talk it through with him, but I didn't get it, but he did. And he was just a master navigator who went from the LRDG pretty quickly into the SAS because Sterling realized just how good an operator Mike was.
Yeah, and I've seen documentary footage of Mike, and just youthful as well. Just like he looked about 35, and he was in the 80s. And just incredibly sharp mind and a twinkle in his eye when he was talking about, I don't know, I was born with the ability basically to look up and think, I know where I am and I know where to get somewhere. I mean, I don't know if I sound jingoistic here or whatever, but I just feel that that's a uniquely English eccentricity to be born with that on this strange little island we live on. We just create these weird eccentrics. Like who is born with that ability?
And I mean, Mike is another conversation in his own right, really, Matt, because like you say, you've hit the nail on the head when you described his personality to a T. In his 80s, and I knew him as a centurion, when perhaps not all of his faculties were what they were 80 years previously, but his mind was still razor sharp, as was his memory. He would be talking through things in minute detail 80-something years later. And he was modest, self-effacing, and as you referred to it as a bit of a twinkle in his eye, I look at it as a lightness of touch. He had that charm, that rare gift that some people possess. And he would be interested in you. If he was on this call now, he'd be wanting to talk to you about you, and you'd be saying, Mike, can we just talk about what A, B, and C? What about when you managed to navigate them right to the airfield in the middle of the, and he'd be saying, well, how's your garden at the moment? What are you growing? He'd be interested in anything. He was just so modest and self-effacing, and it just made him unbelievably wonderful company. And as you say, an eccentricity. When I say to you that as a 16, 17-year-old lad, he went off to Rhodesia to make his own way. He had visions of being a tobacco farmer or a farmer over there. And, I've got sons that are teenagers. The thought of them going off on their own on a ship to set up, they wouldn't know how to tie the shoelaces half the time, never mind set up a business in another country. You know what I mean? Incredible.
Yeah, his son as well, yeah. Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, it's just that we're English eccentric mad thing. It was just beautiful to watch him and the twinkle in his eye. And that obviously we've watched the same documentary, and it sort of brings me on to a question. I'm going to slightly jump ahead and come back to the first missions that Reg goes on and stuff. But in that documentary, there is footage of Reg talking about the landing in Italy, and how they had to row past paratroopers who were drowning in the sea and they weren't allowed to stop and stuff. And it visibly upset some of the other guys that were interviewed, to the point where they sort of like said, I can't film anymore, or they're breaking down crying. And Reg seemed incredibly stoic. And his answer was, we had a job and we had to get it done. Rather than it being a statement, I guess I'm turning it into a question by saying, in your opinion or in your research, do you suppose that was a mask that he was wearing, a front, or was that what he was like? Was he just like, we had a job to get done, that's it, I'm afraid?
I'm glad we're talking about Sicily, because that's the SRS, as they were repurposed, the Special Raiding Squadron.
Yeah,
they were asked to go at the tip of the spear Operation Husky, which is what we're referring to here. And I'm just going to broaden that out by saying if we should talk about Sicily and Italy all in the same conversation in relation to your question about Reg and whether it was a mask or otherwise. So there's two specific aspects. We'll talk about Capo Muro di Porco, because this was the operation that you're talking about, and also Termoli, which happened in October of 1943, 3 or 4 months after July 1943, which is what you're referencing. Okay, so Reg Seekings, and I spoke to his nephews. Reg didn't have any children. Reg and Monica didn't have any children. I spoke to Bob Seekings' children, his sons, and they said that Reg Seekings was goal-oriented. That was first and foremost. It's as you just said, we had a job to do. So that really was indelibly etched into him, and he really would believe that. Whatever else happened here, we've got to complete the mission. We need to get this done. So if that's what needs to happen to ensure we get in, because what they were doing was trying to take out the gun batteries on those cliffs to ensure the main invasion force could come on land. So it was an incredibly important job that the SRS was tasked with. Take out those heavy guns to stop the Navy getting blown out of the water. Really important. So in they went. And so I feel Reg, for that specific operation, it was all about the mission. All about the mission. Let's get this job done. And he won military medal as a result of his actions during Capo Muro di Porco. Let's fast forward to 3 or 4 months in relation to this question. Termoli, he is at the tailgate of a truck. Now, I did catch a little bit of this episode in the later series, and Reg is the centre of episode 4, and his reaction to what was happening, and obviously the shell strike that took out 18 men from Johnny Wiseman's section that Reg was integral to. Reg had trained a lot of these men, had fought a long campaign with a lot of these men through Sicily, up into Italy, and onto Termoli. And I remember watching this video because it was the one thing that I thought, gosh, is he impenetrable? Is there something there? And I remember looking at him when he just said, Termoli was terrible. An interview that was recorded 40 odd years later, and I'm sure it never left him. I'm sure what happened that day, because if I can just expand, Reg was on the tailgate. He was blown by the tailgate. He was blown away. His good pals had 18 of them died as a result of that. There was that shell, and Sergeant Seekings, as he was at that point, he was kind of the first responder. So he saw a pal of his who was dead in flames. Natural instinct, Reg felt, was just to find a jug of water to put the flames out, even though his pal was dead. He had 2 other pals who were in the last moments of their lives. He tried to do what he could for them in those last moments. So I know there was compassion there. And I was sort of given some private notes by Eric Musk, his pal. And I'll just try and find them because it sort of sum up just the sort of man he was. And Musk wrote this: Sergeant Seekings collected all the arms, legs, heads, etc., and made sure they were all belonging to the right person. We then buried them. So I think you're talking about a man who was determined to give those dead men the dignity they deserved. Okay, so he is goal-oriented, but there's compassion there too. He wasn't just a heavyweight, brawn, no brain, no compassion. Reg Seekings absolutely had a heart, and I think it was outlined there in what his pal wrote. Reg collected the dismembered limbs so that they could be buried properly. I found that very powerful when I was researching it and writing it. I don't know what it sounds like to discuss it, but just so in answer to your question, there was a toughness about him that meant job was really, really important, but there was a heart too.
Yeah, and I mean, there was no judgment in the question. I was just wondering what type of, whether later on in life it sort of came back to haunt him, or this, like it does for a lot of people. I mean, if you're on a landing craft going in to take out a gun battery, in the middle of the bloody night to make sure that the Navy don't get blown out of the water. I'm assuming your heart rate is about 300 and your adrenaline is coming out of your ears. You can understand why you wouldn't want anything to get in your way. There's zero judgment there. I was interested because he was interviewed in the 1980s where he still had this barrel chest, beautiful big barrel chest, boxer's chest, and very stoic in the seat. And he just said it was a job to be done. But I do remember him saying terminally terrible as well. I do remember that, and I'm thinking, oh goodness me, if he says it's terrible, God knows what it was like.
Yeah, I mean, and his brother Bob also fought in Sicily and also fought up into Termoli, and I spoke to his middle son about this, Reg Seekings, who went on to be a major in the Paras in his life, and he said that his father, Bob Seekings, came back from the war and had night terrors, night sweats, and they went away for a period of time, and then they returned again later in life. So he never forgot what happened in those operations, as you say. Just Bob it just struck me. I'd love to go for a pint with Bob. I think I'd be rather intimidated and in awe of Reg because of that, as that person that you just depicted, even in his 60s as he was then, big broad moustache, everything was spot on. Bob he liked horse racing, he liked cricket. I'm sure I would have just really enjoyed sitting back and being in Bob's company. But he came back and it stayed with him. It must have been so challenging. And I remember talking to Kerry about something that Bob did with Eric. They neutralised a gun position when they were a part of that operation on Sicily, and they used that fire and manoeuvre. And I think the driving force for them both was, we don't let each other down here. You go forward, I go forward. And I love that courage of, because they would have felt the fear and gone forward anyway. And that just really gets to me,
Yeah, yes, that is. Interviewing a lot of people or just reading or doing research, that's the thing that defines courage. Everybody's scared. It's doing what you have, despite being scared. There is no such thing as sort of Bruce Willis courage. Do you know what I mean?
100%. And I'm sure, I mean, I spoke to Mike about this, Mike Sadler, when we were talking about Operation Bigamy at the gates of Benghazi, or just outside Benghazi, in September 1942. And he was sort of saying when he had to jump and man the Vickers K guns, he had to jump on the guns, and he said it was vaguely exhilarating. There was a kind of excitement to it, but as you say, the adrenaline must have been going off the charts in an instant like that, where you're responding to fire by jumping on the Vickers Ks. I mean, I can't imagine what my ticker would have been going like in pitch black in that sort of situation. And how do you get through all that? How do you come down from that?
Well, exactly, yeah. How do you come down from that? Yeah. I think they took a lot of pills, didn't they?
Yeah. Although the type of pills, weren't they on Benzedrine? I'm not sure they're the pills that brought you down,
Those are pills that send you up. I think they might give something to bring it back down again as well. I guess, seeing as though we're sort of getting into it, and I think the first season of Rogue Heroes covers the missions in a Commando comic type way, but rather well. So I think maybe we'll move on past that, and maybe we'll go into what we don't know yet. And so, was it around the time of after Termoli that the SAS then expands and becomes almost, rather than a ragtag band of dudes, it becomes like brigade size, like 1,500 men?
So obviously, as I outlined earlier, there was 60-something men, L detachment, September 1941. Within a year, that had grown. I think there was nearly 600 men on strength by October 1942. I was having a look at those numbers actually earlier today, and strength for Husky, Operation Husky, or for their part in it, The SRS was at around 280. By the time they got to Termini, that was 207 overall strength. When they came back, they went back to being, because they were still the SAS in their mind, but they were repurposed as the SRS. But in January 1944, as part of the preparations for Overlord, the Special Air Service just expanded massively and became around 2,500. It went through a massive expansion and recruitment drive. And so at that point, Reg, Paddy Mayne actually, who was by then, of course, in charge of one SAS, because David Stirling had been captured in the early part of 1943, well, the late stages of the North Africa, the Desert War. And so Mayne says to Reg, I want you to take commission. Reg says that he didn't want to be an officer. And then there's a bit of to and fro. And it comes down to Reg accepting warrant status, squadron sergeant major. Now that really suited Reg, that role, because it meant that he was right at the very heart of that unit. He wasn't slightly remote with the officers. He had to work with the officers, of course, as squadron sergeant major, but he was still a man of the people. He was still, very much in with the other ranks. Implementing what the officers had decided, what the plan, as well as being able to have his own initiative, which he had a fair amount of. And so that was Reg's. He'd gradually moved from private status, lance corporal, sergeant, and by January 1944, squadron sergeant major as a SAS, or as he was part of an operation called Houndsworth, which in June of 1944 he ended up actually getting shot himself.
Oh, okay. I was going to ask if he was ever wounded.
Yes. So he'd had so much good fortune. At times, it seemed incredible how lucky he was. But I don't think you can get luckier than being shot in the base of your skull, just there in that sort of crevice or inlet at the top of your spine. And he was shot there at fairly short range. And survive. So the bullet lodged there and wasn't actually taken out till A Squadron, which he was attached to, got back to England autumn of 1944. So he lived with a bullet stuck deep inside him and carried on operations. So he took the hit. I think it was June the 27th. It was the Battle of Vermont, across a valley, and he ends up making a rare mistake. So he got too close to they were stalking an enemy gunner that they knew was protecting transport on the other side of the valley. They'd gone through some dead ground, and they came up the other side. Reg sticks his head up, sees last second, sees this guy, right, tries to go duck down, but as he goes down, he gets shot. And he gets carried off, or he doesn't get carried off the battlefield, actually. It's quite bizarre. He falls into a state that Reg, who's not given to flights of fancy, so he said that it felt like he was going through sort of an underground waterway, rattling, in which he saw ex-girlfriends, his mum, moments from his life kind of flashing around in his mind as he crashed through this underground waterway. Now, Reg, as I say, he's the most down-to-earth, pragmatic, practical person, not given to turns of fanciful phrase. So this is quite strange that he's gone on record and spoken about this. But he pulls himself out of that underground river and realizes where he is. And with the assistance of another SAS old-timer, Jack Terry, manages to sort of get himself away. And he drops his pipe as he runs for the cover of an old injured tree. Now, what do you do if you've dropped your pipe? You've got a bullet lodged in the back of your head. Oh, I've dropped my pipe. I'll go back and get it. So he runs back and gets his pipe. Why do you do that? I mean, so he gets his pipe. He found it. And then he spent much of the next week kind of unconscious and not with it, and had the SAS Padre, Fraser McCluskey, tending to him and looking after him and helping him come round, because for a week he doesn't really know what's going on other than it rained. That was kind of his recollection of his next week. But in the immediate aftermath, he found himself in this underground river and then searching for his pipe. Madness. That's what happens if you get shot in the head.
Bullet lodged in the back. He was, in fact, made out of steel. So we touched slightly upon, or you mentioned Overlord. I haven't actually read on this far, so I don't know. What was the SAS role in Overlord? What was Reg's role in Overlord? Was it before Overlord? Were they disrupting supply lines and that kind of stuff? Was it sort of part?
Yeah. Just to finish on the Bullet. So the Bullet stays there for 3 months, however long it was, months. He comes back, he gets it removed. He has it made into a brooch at some point in the future for his lady that was his wife, Monica. And she lost the brooch. You go to that lengths, you take a bullet for your wife, and she loses it. Can you believe that?
Yes. I once read a story of a guy from Wales, was it? I don't know, it's a Welsh miner, something like that, who during World War One was granted, because he was a miner or something like that, leave from going to the front, i.e. he wasn't supposed to go to the front because he was needed on the home front. His wife gave him such a hard time because he wasn't out there fighting that he gave up his job and volunteered and went to the front just to get away from her nagging, and then was shot and killed. And I was like, yep, that's what being married is all about.
That's awful. That's awful. At least Reg survived that bullet, even if the bullet didn't survive in the long run. But to get back to your point about Overlord, so initially, so it's decided that the SAS are to be used for strategic purposes. They're not going to be used in the main around the beachheads. Okay, right. So I understand there was a small party that was used for one specific moment around the beachheads, but in the main, the SAS are used for their strategic purposes, which is to be dropped many miles behind the lines. In Reg's instance, in the Morvan, this side of Dijon, and they are to stop Das Reich flooding up towards the beachheads. Okay, so with the sabotage activities, the ambush work, exactly as you outlined, because at that time they were going through a refurb and a refit down in the south, and the idea was, let's stop reinforcements flooding to the beachheads in Normandy. So that was why the SAS were used in the capacity that they were. Reg was on an operation called Houndsworth. There were other operations across France, including Bull Basket, which was quite a famous operation. But Reg is on Houndsworth, and it does what it's meant to do. Lots of sabotage activities. And after he's been shot, he has his week or two off, just recuperating from all of that. And within a week or two, he had his head bandaged back up, and he's back in the fight.
That's incredible. That's incredible. Oh, I didn't realize. I didn't realize that the SAS were part of stopping Das Reich getting to the beaches.
That was it. Yeah.
That in and of itself is fascinating. It sort of culminates at Oradour-sur-Glane and the massacre there, where it's just all this sort of like sabotage and massacres, and they take out that SS guy and they end up setting fire to him, and then it's a crazy story, that just stopping this Das Reich Panzer Division getting there and pushing everybody back is absolutely incredible story in and of itself. And then I think, like I said, I think I haven't read ahead, but like tidbits from there. Does he ends up in Germany by the end?
Yeah. So really important work that the SAS do all across France. They come back into their new base, was because early 1944, that I explained to you, when he was promoted to Squadron Sergeant Major, they were in Ayrshire, a place called Darvel. Yep. However, by late 1944, they were at Highlands House in Chelmsford, and the SAS were actually dotted across Essex in 2 or 3 other stately properties, but A Squadron, Paddy Main's men, they are Highlands House, and it's over the following months, plans are made how we're going to use special forces in the closing stages of the war, and it's decided that Reg will be part of a force called Frank Force, which was a composite formation of some of those from one SAS and some of those from two SAS under the command of Brian Franks. And so for an operation, Operation Archway, and that takes place at the end of March 1945. It commences, and over they go into the Rhineland. And initially, Reg is used as Frank Force are used. Reg's description of it was basically they were reconnaissance, but also if the main army was getting held up, the SAS were sent round the rear, create havoc, blast a hole to open the way forward, and on the main force would drive on upwards into the Rhineland. So that was kind of how his Operation Archway. That's what happened. Several firefights, several nasty skirmishes, really, really ugly fighting. But because by this point, remember, they're in Hitler's backyard, and if you have to think about it, they were fighting some increasingly desperate opposition, and they were getting stalked themselves in the way that they had so often sabotaged and ambushed the enemy. This time they were finding their spearhead up into the Rhineland was coming across similar tactics in the woods. They would be ambushed. And Reg had one really, really close call at a crossroads one day. It was about April the 8th, 1945. And he said he was almost to the point in tears where he was saying, how the hell am I going to get out of this? Well, with his great pal, Johnny Cooper, they find a way. And that was kind of his last serious fighting of the war. The closing weeks in Germany, he was actually attached to a field security patrol that were tasked with finding suspected Nazi war criminals. So he's actually got a very different role in those final few weeks.
Yeah.
Obviously, as part of that, as the SAS Jeep patrols have gone through Germany, heading northeastwards, they have come across Bergen-Belsen, where they were actually sent in to assess the medical requirements for the army medical teams and the Red Cross, because they knew there was serious amounts of typhus and typhoid causing deaths. And so they went in there, yellow armbands as non-combatants, and it was where it was written about in another book by an officer who was there, on Randall, who basically said Reg Seekings thumped out an enemy soldier who'd been mistreating one of those held captive there. Reg was so outraged, he asked his officer commanding, Major Tonkin, can I hand out retribution? When permission was given, Reg, with all that boxing champion's brawn, hits the enemy soldier, knocks him over. The enemy soldier, or the guard, I should say, stands back up, and Reg knocks him down again. His moral code had been outraged by what he'd seen as the mistreatment of those. And he was horrified at what he was seeing. In fact, his great pal, Johnny Cooper, wrote in his book that Reg was just experiencing utter rage at what he saw and experienced in Bergen-Belsen on April the 15th, 1945.
Oh, Bass. Before I sort of ask you the last question, I'll ask you a question I should have asked right at the beginning, which is the title of your book, which you should all read now, by the way, because it sounds fascinating, is Duty Before Glory. Why did you land on that? There you go. We'll put a link on the podcast. In fact,
so SAS, Duty Before Glory. So it comes back to what his father said.
Yeah.
Duty. Do your duty, okay?
Right.
Whatever else happens, and those words stayed with him throughout. You've got to do your duty. You don't let anyone down at any point. So it was duty, but actually he ended up with glory. He was one of the most highly decorated Special Forces soldiers of World War II, DCM, MM, mentioned in dispatches, an incredible series of gallantry awards. And so he earned glory, but it was duty that drove him. So duty before glory. And that was always at the heart of everything. You must do your duty. So that was the name of the book.
Yeah, good time. I guess the last question I want to ask before I let you go is how was his assimilation back after he was demobbed? Is part of the question, and the B part of that question is: was he done with the military then, or did he have any affiliation afterwards? Any training or anything? Was he just done, demobbed, go back home, marry his girlfriend, done?
So the good news is obviously that Reg made it home. So did Bob, and so did their great pal Eric Musk, and they all got married in short order around the mid 1940s. Reg married Monica that summer. They were married for over 50 years, which is kind of wonderful. That he came home and married her in her idyllic Suffolk village of Stanton, and he lived out his final years in Stanton with Monica. In between, so he comes home and he becomes a landlord. Pub's no longer there. The Rifleman's Arms in Ely, he was there from mid-40s to the 1950s. Now, his service records show that in the early 1950s, he attended an SAS training period in one summer with 2-3 SAS. So 1951, but I'd have to double check. But it was at Otley. So that suggests that he retained a link with the reservist SAS at that time, and but he never spoke about it. So we don't know anything more other than this note in his service papers that says he was at Otley with 2-3 SAS. He goes to southern Rhodesia in the mid-1950s to become a tobacco farmer, where he ends up as an auxiliary inspector for the Peace Anti-Terrorist Unit. Remember, this is the time when the Bush War is not just before the Bush War. He goes to Rhodesia, the Bush War of the 60s and 70s, and he ends up as a reservist inspector, basically training young officers. And I spoke to one young officer who was trained by Reg on a course. And he said this, he said, we didn't know who this English guy was, but he was just seriously impressive. Everything he did was just incredibly professional. There was always a rationale and a reason. And he made sure you did everything to the letter, finished what you were doing, then did it again and again till it was so ingrained. And at the end of this course, they were like, well, who is this English guy? And they went and found out who he was from someone else who was aware of Seekings' past. But Reg never spoke about all of this, all that he'd achieved, all that he'd been part of. He was just modest, did what he did, and loved doing what he went on to do the rest of his life for a period of time in Rhodesia before he returned in the early 80s from Zimbabwe to England. So he was incredibly modest and you have to remember when the war finished in 1945, he was 25 years old. So he then had another 50 odd years of his life. I mean, he packed so much into that first 25 years. Everything else sort of seems a bit like a footnote, but it wasn't for him. There was loads of other stuff that happened for him. He was a really remarkable man, and it was absolutely my privilege to put down football, horse racing, and golf, and research an area that has absorbed and fascinated me. And like I say, a different level of gallantry to last-minute winners, to penalty saves, to hat tricks, or anything like that. I mean, this just was just a different level.
Fantastic. Well, it's been brilliant talking to you, man. We've had you for an hour. I'm going to let you go. Leighton has read the book and says it's absolutely brilliant and a great read. Make sure everybody who's listening reads the book. We will put a link in the description for the podcast. It's been great talking to you, Tony. And I thought you were a great interview. Don't worry. You're not Bobby Schofield, but then only Bobby Schofield's Bobby Schofield.
It's been an absolute... it's been fascinating. I've loved drilling down and chatting through some of these aspects of Reg's life and his background. And, what a great interview you are. Here I am going to blow some smoke. That was easy. I was sitting here dreading this an hour ago, thinking this is going to be so tricky wicket, but it was great. Really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, man. And just one last thing is at one point I will do an SAS tour. and I'd like you possibly to help consult and put it together, because I mentioned it on my last tour and everyone's eyes went. So one time we'll get together and figure out how to do an SAS tour, because
it's where I want to go. Wouldn't it be fun to go where I think it would be amazing? And I'm told it's brilliant. Exactly where we were just discussing, Sicily, Capo Muro de Porco, where the gliders came in. Apparently, you can still see the gun nests. You can still see quite a lot of, what exactly those landmarks that the SAS men will have used or the SRS used and utilised. And apparently, it's a brilliant tour to go on. So let's get together and make a plan to head to Syracuse.
Yes, brother. All right. Thank you so much, Tony. Thanks for coming on.
Loved it. Thanks again. Cheers now. Take care. Thank you.
Bye. All right. Well, that was Tony, and that was a really, really good interview. I'm going to sign off now, as you may hear that I am dying of man flu. So apologies if this
I've heard it going around. So well done for fighting your own battle for the last hour. It really was genuinely great fun, and I won't quite say apprehensive, but I was thinking, well, how am I going to be Bobby Schofield? How can I be as entertaining as Matt? And I'm hoping that it kind of was in its own way.
It was brilliant. All right, thanks, man. Thanks for listening, everybody.
All the best. Take care. See you on. Take care.
Thanks for our Patreons. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks to everybody. That was a great interview, and I will see you again next week. Hopefully I won't be a snuffy, snivelly wreck. Hopefully my son won't be screaming in the background. But, this is how we roll on We're Happy For You. Cheers, guys. Bye.